Each year, military installations across the United States report encounters with unidentified aerial entities that demonstrate flight characteristics impossible for any known aircraft, biological creature, or experimental technology currently in development. It occurs with such alarming frequency that the Department of Defense maintains a dedicated task force within the Defense Intelligence Agency consuming over $300 million annually in classified investigations into phenomena that seem to exist at the far intersection of the supernatural and the technological. The Cold War era of 1960-67 saw the Appalachian region of West Virginia transformed into a strategic fortress with over 47 underground bunkers, weapons depots, and communications facilities hidden beneath the mountains, housing thousands of military personnel tasked with monitoring Soviet communications and preparing for potential nuclear escalation. For a brief period during the winter months leading up to December 1967, personnel stationed at a classified listening post near Point Pleasant would encounter something so profoundly disturbing and prophetic that it would force the United States military to reevaluate whether certain phenomena exist not as threats to be neutralized, but as harbingers of catastrophes that cannot be prevented. But what exactly was the massive winged entity that appeared repeatedly to soldiers in the Ohio River Valley? And why did every single person who witnessed it firsthand experience devastating personal tragedies in the months that followed, as if the creature itself was a living omen of doom? The Ohio River Valley, spanning the border between West Virginia and Ohio, encompasses approximately 2,300 square miles of dense Appalachian forest, winding rivers, and isolated communities that have existed in relative obscurity since the late 18th century. The region's strategic importance during the Cold War cannot be overstated, as its natural geography provided ideal cover for underground military installations designed to survive nuclear attack, with the area's limestone caves and thick forest canopy offering both concealment and structural stability for facilities that needed to remain operational, even during atomic warfare. The winters here are particularly brutal, with temperatures regularly dropping below freezing and thick fog rolling off the Ohio River to blanket the valleys in an almost supernatural darkness that can persist for days at a time, creating an environment where visibility drops to mere feet and the boundary between reality and imagination becomes dangerously thin. It is perhaps unsurprising, then, that this region has been the site of unexplained phenomena dating back centuries before American military forces ever established a presence in these ancient hills. The indigenous Shawnee and Iroquois tribes, who inhabited this valley before European colonization, maintained detailed oral histories of a creature they called Mishabeshu, or sometimes the Thunderbird's dark brother, a massive winged entity that appeared during times of great upheaval and disaster. According to translations of tribal records preserved by Jesuit missionaries in the 1740s, this being stood over 7 feet tall with wings, spanning 15 to 20 feet, possessed eyes that glowed with an infernal red light that could be seen for miles away in the darkness, and appeared always as a warning that death was coming to the community on a massive scale. The Shawnees specifically documented an appearance of this entity in the autumn of 1755, just 3 months before a devastating flood swept through their riverside settlements and killed over 200 people, and again in 1782, immediately preceding the Nananhutton Massacre, where 96 Christian Delaware were murdered by Pennsylvania militiamen. The descriptions from these 18th century accounts are disturbingly specific, mentioning the creature's gray-brown coloring, its ability to take flight without any visible movement of its wings, and most terrifying of all, the overwhelming sense of dread and impending doom that accompanied every sighting, as if the entity itself radiated an aura of catastrophe that infected the minds of all who witnessed it. Similar encounters were reported by military personnel stationed in the region during World War II, when the area housed several prisoner of war camps and training facilities. Classified reports from November 1943 recently declassified under Freedom of Information Act requests, described multiple sightings by sentries at Camp Ashland of what they initially believed to be an enemy aircraft or experimental glider until the object landed in a clearing and revealed itself to be something entirely different. Staff Sergeant Edmund Holloway, in his official report filed November 18, 1943, described an entity standing upright like a man but covered in dark, feathers or fur with wings that folded against its body and eyes that reflected his flashlight, beam with an intense red glow like illuminated rubies the size of baseballs. What makes Holloway's account particularly credible is that 3 other soldiers witnessed the same entity simultaneously from different positions, and all 4 men provided consistent descriptions, despite being separated and interviewed individually by military intelligence officers. The pattern that emerges from these historical accounts is deeply disturbing. Each sighting occurred during periods of heightened tension or immediately before tragic events, and witnesses consistently reported an overwhelming psychological effect that went beyond simple fear, describing instead a bone-deep certainty that something terrible was about to happen, a premonition that proved horrifyingly accurate in nearly every documented case. November 12, 1966, 0340 hours. Staff Sergeant Vincent Calabrese Calcine, priest, due to his brief seminary education before enlisting, was conducting his routine perimeter check of installation. Delta 7, a classified signals intelligence facility, buried 30 feet beneath an apparently abandoned TNT plant on the outskirts of Point Pleasant. Calabrese had served 2 tours in Vietnam before requesting transfer to this remote posting, hoping for the quiet monotony of Cold War surveillance duty after the chaos of jungle warfare. And for the first 8 months of his assignment, the most exciting event had been a black bear wandering too close to the facility's camouflaged entrance. The night was brutally cold, with temperatures hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit and a thick fog rolling off the Ohio River that reduced visibility to perhaps 20 feet in any direction, transforming the skeletal remains of the old munitions plant into a maze of shadows and rusted metal that seemed to absorb sound itself. Accompanying Calabrese on this particular patrol was Private First Class Raymond Dalacroix, a 22-year-old communications specialist from Louisiana who had been assigned to Delta 7 only 3 weeks prior, and Specialist Thomas Garrett, nicknamed Radar for his almost supernatural ability to detect incoming radio signals before the equipment registered them. The 3 men were approximately 400 yards from the facility's entrance, moving through what had once been the plant's loading area, when Calabrese noticed that his handheld radio had begun emitting a strange oscillating tone that shouldn't have been possible, given that it was set to a specific encrypted military frequency, the sound rising and falling in pitch like electronic breathing. Dalacroix confirmed that his radio was producing the same inexplicable sound, and when Garrett checked the portable spectrum analyzer he carried for detecting enemy surveillance attempts, the device showed something that made his face go pale in the glow of its screen. Every frequency across the entire electromagnetic spectrum was spiking simultaneously, as if something was broadcasting on every possible wavelength at once, with such power that it was overwhelming their equipment. The temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees in the span of seconds, and the fog around them began to move in ways that fog simply should not move, swirling in tight vertical spirals like miniature tornadoes, while the air filled with a smell that Calabrese would later describe as a mixture of ozone, rotting vegetation, and something organic that reminded him disturbingly of the scent of blood. That's when they heard a sound that started so low, it was felt more than heard, a deep thrumming vibration that seemed to resonate in their chest cavities and make their teeth ache, then rising in pitch until it became a high-pitched shriek that was somehow both mechanical and organic, like metal scraping against metal, but with an underlying quality that suggested vocal cords, or something similar producing the noise. The sound came from above them, and when all three men instinctively raised their flashlights toward the skeletal framework of the old TNT plant's processing tower, where the beams illuminated something perched on the rusted metal structure, approximately 40 feet above ground level, that caused Garrett to actually drop his spectrum analyzer and take 3 stumbling steps backward. The entity stood upright like a human, but was clearly not human, standing at least 7.5 feet tall, with a body that seemed to be covered in gray-brown plumage that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making its exact shape difficult to determine, despite the powerful military-grade flashlights trained directly on it. What drew immediate attention were the eyes, 2 massive oval shapes that glowed with an intense red luminescence that didn't simply reflect the flashlight beams, but seemed to generate their own light from within, each orb approximately 6 inches in diameter and positioned on what might have been a head, though the entity's anatomy was disturbingly ambiguous, as if its body didn't quite conform to normal 3-dimensional space. The wings were what transformed this from merely bizarre to absolutely terrifying. They unfurled from the creature's back with a sound like canvas being ripped, extending to a span that Calabrese later calculated must have been at least 18 to 20 feet from tip to tip, the membranes between the supporting structures appearing almost translucent, in the flashlight beams revealing a network of dark veins, or possibly something more mechanical like wiring or circuitry running through organic tissue. The 3 soldiers stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 to 20 seconds. And during that time, Delacroix would later report in his official statement that he experienced an overwhelming psychological assault that went far beyond simple fear, describing it as a crushing certainty that he was going to die soon. Not in that moment, but inevitably and horribly, and that everyone he loved would suffer terribly, and that he was somehow directly responsible for catastrophes that hadn't even happened yet. Calabrese made the decision to retreat, barking orders for the men to fall back to the facility entrance while maintaining visual contact with the entity. But as they began their tactical withdrawal, the creature launched itself from its perch without any visible movement of its wings, simply dropping from the tower and then impossibly changing direction mid-air to shoot upward at a velocity that seemed to violate basic physics. The entity circled above them 3 times, its wings now beating with a sound like industrial machinery, a rhythmic whooshing that was far too loud and powerful for anything biological. And each pass it made overhead caused their radio equipment to shriek with interference and their flashlights to flicker and dim, as if the creature was somehow draining electrical energy from the environment around it. Then, with shocking suddenness, it descended directly toward Garrett, who had become separated from the other 2 men by perhaps 30 feet during the chaotic retreat, and the specialist raised his rifle and fired 7 rounds directly at the approaching entity from a distance of less than 50 feet, shots that should have been impossible to miss, but seemed to pass through the creature without any effect whatsoever, as if it wasn't entirely solid or existed slightly out of phase with normal reality. The entity reached Garrett, and what happened next would haunt Calabrese and Delacroix for the rest of their lives. The creature's wings enveloped the specialist completely, wrapping around him like a dark cocoon, while those massive red eyes intensified in brightness until they were almost painful to look at directly. And Garrett began to scream, not in pain, but in absolute psychological anguish, shrieking about his wife and daughter dying in fire, about bridges collapsing and water rising, and everyone drowning, about seeing his own death and being unable to prevent it. The attack, if it could be called that, lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Then the entity released Garrett and shot vertically upward with such speed that it was gone from sight in less than 2 seconds, leaving no trace except the overwhelming smell of ozone, and the specialist curled in the fetal position on the frozen ground, weeping uncontrollably and repeating over and over, December 15th, the bridge, everyone dies. I saw it. I saw all of them die. Calabrese immediately activated the facility's emergency protocols, dragging the still hysterical Garrett back to installation. Delta 7, while Delacroix provided rear security, both men expecting the entity to return at any moment, but encountering only the oppressive silence of the foggy November night. Once inside the bunker's secure entrance, Calabrese attempted to radio the incident to their commanding officer, Colonel Harrison, Teague, stationed at Fort Beaver in Virginia, but discovered that every communication system in the facility was experiencing catastrophic failure. With radio transmitters producing only distorted static, the encrypted teletype machines printing pages of random characters interspersed with what appeared to be repeated sequences of numbers and dates, and even the basic telephone landlines emitting a strange pulsing tone that made it painful to hold the receiver against their ears for more than a few seconds. The facility's chief technical officer, Warrant Officer Frank Esposito, a communications expert with 17 years of military experience, spent 3 hours attempting to diagnose the equipment failures and concluded that every system had been subjected to what he described as an electromagnetic pulse of unprecedented intensity and duration, the kind of effect that should only be possible from a nuclear detonation or extremely advanced directed energy weapon. Certainly nothing that could be generated by a biological entity, regardless of how anomalous it might be. Garrett remained in a state of severe psychological shock, rocking back and forth in the facility's small medical bay, while clutching a rosary he'd pulled from his personal effects, repeatedly warning anyone who would listen that the Silver Bridge is as going to fall. Everyone on it will die December 15th at 5 p.m. I saw their faces underwater. I saw the children. The following morning, after communications had mysteriously restored themselves around dawn, Calabrese filed his report with Colonel Teague, who responded with surprising speed by dispatching a specialized investigation team from Fort Meade, arriving via helicopter. Less than 6 hours after the initial call, despite the remote location and typically glacial pace of military bureaucracy, the team consisted of 3 civilians in military escort who identified themselves only as specialists from Project Blue Book Extension, a designation that Calabrese had never encountered in any official documentation, led by a woman in her mid-40s who introduced herself as Dr. Sarah Blackwood and immediately began conducting interviews with each witness separately, while her 2 associates examined the site of the encounter with equipment that looked far more advanced than standard military issue. Dr. Blackwood's questioning was disturbingly specific, asking whether the entity's eyes had appeared to track movement or simply glow uniformly, whether the wings had made any sound when folded against the body, whether anyone had experienced nosebleeds or temporal disorientation during or after the encounter, and most unsettlingly, whether any of the witnesses had experienced spontaneous knowledge of future events or felt compelled to warn others about impending disasters. When Calabrese asked why these questions seemed so specific, as if she had encountered this exact phenomenon before, Blackwood produced a manila folder marked with classification stamps he didn't recognize and showed him approximately 40 incident reports spanning from 1938 to 1965, each describing encounters with a virtually identical entity in locations across West Virginia, southern Ohio, and western Pennsylvania, always appearing in the weeks or months before major disasters. The 1940 Tacoma Narrows Bridge collapse, the 1944 Cleveland East Ohio gas explosion that killed 130 people, the 1962 Centralia mine fire, and over a dozen other catastrophes, both natural and man-made. The most disturbing document in the folder was a psychiatric evaluation from 1954 detailing what happened to an Army Corps of Engineers captain who had encountered the entity near the Fort Randolph ammunition depot. The officer had become obsessed with warning people about a disaster he claimed to have foreseen during his encounter, specifically a massive explosion that would occur at the depot in exactly 6 months. And when his superiors dismissed his warnings as evidence of mental breakdown and confined him to psychiatric observation, he had hanged himself in his cell 3 weeks before the disaster he'd predicted occurred exactly as he described, killing 47 military personnel and civilians. Dr. Blackwood explained, with a clinical detachment that somehow made it more horrifying, that every documented witness to the entity experienced what they termed catastrophic precognition, receiving vivid and accurate visions of future disasters that they were psychologically compelled to try to prevent despite having no means to do so, and that approximately 60% of these witnesses died by suicide or under suspicious circumstances within 18 months of their encounter, unable to cope with the psychological burden of knowing disasters were coming and being unable to stop them. She then asked Calabrese and Delacroix a question that made both men's blood run cold. Have either of you experienced any visions or sudden knowledge about future events since your encounter? Delacroix admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that he had been seeing flashes every time he closed his eyes. Images of the TNT plant itself, exploding, of military personnel running, while fire consumed everything, and a date that kept appearing in his mind. January 8, 1967. That night, November 15th, at approximately 2,200 hours, the entity returned to Installation Delta 7. But this time, it wasn't alone. Sergeant Angela Morrison, who had been assigned to replace Garrett on perimeter duty while the specialist underwent psychiatric evaluation, reported seeing not one, but 7 distinct entities perched on various structures around the abandoned TNT plant, all exhibiting the same gray-brown plumage and massive glowing red eyes, positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern, forming a rough circle around the facility's hidden entrance. Morrison, a former Olympic-level athlete who had distinguished herself during Ranger training and was known for her exceptional composure under pressure, attempted to maintain her professional demeanor while radioing the observation back to the facility, but her voice on the recorded transmission betrays escalating panic as she describes the entities beginning to move in perfect synchronization, their heads turning in unison to focus those terrible red eyes on her position, and then all 7 launching themselves into the air and circling the facility in a coordinated aerial pattern that was clearly intelligent and purposeful. The entities maintained this circling pattern for 17 minutes, during which every piece of electronic equipment within Installation Delta 7 began to malfunction. Simultaneously, computer systems displaying cascading errors and cryptic warnings, the ventilation system's motors burning out one by one, filling the underground facility with the smell of electrical fire. And most disturbing of all, the facility's seismograph, normally used to detect Soviet underground nuclear tests, registered vibrations that shouldn't have been possible, indicating massive impacts occurring at regular intervals, despite no one on the surface reporting hearing or seeing anything striking the ground. Morrison, now joined by Calabrese and 4 other personnel who had rushed to the surface when the entities appeared, watched helplessly as the creatures suddenly ceased their circling and instead began to dive directly toward the facility's entrance in sequence, one after another, pulling up at the last possible moment and releasing sounds that were somehow both screams and mechanical alarms, each pass creating a wave of psychological pressure that Morrison described as feeling like grief and terror and guilt, all compressed into a single overwhelming emotion that made it almost impossible to think rationally. On the 7th and final pass, the lead entity, distinguishable by its slightly larger size and eyes that burned with an even more intense crimson glow, descended to within 10 feet of the assembled soldiers and simply hovered there, its wings beating with that impossible mechanical rhythm, while every human present experienced what Dr. Blackwood would later classify as a collective precognitive event, each person simultaneously receiving the same vision. A bridge packed with rush hour traffic during the Christmas shopping season, the structure's suspension cables beginning to fail, cars sliding into the icy Ohio River below, screams and darkness and cold water, and through it all, this entity and its 6 companions perched on the bridge's towers, simply watching with those burning red eyes as if bearing witness to a catastrophe they had known was inevitable, their presence not causing the disaster, but marking it, heralding it, ensuring that someone would know it was coming, even if that knowledge proved useless to prevent it. Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, all 7 entities shot upward into the night sky and vanished, leaving behind only the lingering smell of ozone and 6 soldiers who now shared Garrett's burden of terrible knowledge. All of them knowing with absolute certainty that on December 15th, 1967, the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant to Ohio was going to collapse during evening rush hour, and that dozens of people were going to die, and that there was nothing they could do to stop it. The month between the mass sighting and the predicted date of December 15th transformed Installation Delta 7 from a routine signals intelligence post into something resembling a psychological warfare experiment gone catastrophically wrong. Every single person who had witnessed the entities, now numbering 13 military personnel after additional sightings occurred on November 18th, November 24th, and December 2nd, experienced escalating precognitive visions that grew more detailed and more disturbing with each passing day, seeing not just the bridge collapse, but specific individuals who would die, hearing their final words, feeling the cold water filling their lungs, experiencing their deaths over and over again with such vividness that several soldiers became unable to sleep without sedation. Garrett, who had been the first to receive the visions, deteriorated rapidly, despite round-the-clock psychiatric care, developing a compulsion to draw the bridge collapse from every conceivable angle, filling notebook after notebook with sketches that showed impossible perspectives, as if he was viewing the disaster simultaneously from dozens of different positions, including from underwater, looking up at sinking vehicles, and from high above, as if seeing through the eyes of something flying far overhead. Dr. Blackwood's team established a permanent presence at the facility, bringing in additional specialists in parapsychology, quantum physics, and something they referred to only as temporal mechanics, all attempting to understand the mechanism by which the entities transmitted precognitive information and whether it might be possible to interfere with or prevent the predicted disaster. The entities themselves appeared with increasing frequency as December 15th approached, no longer limiting their manifestations to nighttime, but now appearing in broad daylight, perched on water towers, power line structures, and the steel framework of the TNT plant, in plain view of multiple witnesses, both military and civilian. Local residents of Point Pleasant began reporting sightings to police, describing a bird as large as a small airplane and glowing red eyes visible from over a mile away, and the small town was becoming increasingly gripped by hysteria that military authorities were desperately trying to contain through a coordinated disinformation campaign involving wildlife experts, claiming the sightings were merely sandhill cranes or other large birds, misidentified due to poor lighting conditions. But the creatures were far too large, far too obviously anomalous, and appeared to far too many credible witnesses for the official explanations to be even remotely plausible. And by early December, the town was filled with journalists, UFO researchers, and curiosity seekers, all hoping to witness the phenomenon for themselves. Colonel Teague, now personally present at installation Delta 7, and clearly operating under orders from authorities far above his typical chain of command, made the decision to attempt direct communication with the entities by constructing a massive illuminated signal array on December 8th. Using high-intensity lights to flash patterns based on mathematical sequences and basic symbolic representations of peaceful intent, the military equivalent of trying to initiate first contact with an alien intelligence. The response came at 0300 hours on December 9th, when over 20 entities descended on the facility simultaneously in what could only be described as an aerial assault, though they carried no weapons and made no attempt to physically harm anyone, instead subjecting everyone present, including the soldiers, inside the hardened underground bunker, to a psychic bombardment that Dr. Blackwood's instruments registered as massive fluctuations in localized electromagnetic fields and what she termed coherent probability waves, theoretical physics concepts that shouldn't have been measurable with any existing technology. Every person in or near the facility experienced the same intensely vivid vision simultaneously, but this time it wasn't limited to the bridge. Collapse, they saw decades of disasters stretching into the future plane, crashes and building collapses, and explosions and floods, each one marked by the presence of these entities watching from nearby vantage points. And underlying all of these visions was a terrible understanding that the creatures weren't causing these disasters, but were instead something far more disturbing. They were observers or markers or heralds of inevitable events that existed at intersection points of catastrophic probability. Manifestations of disasters themselves, given form in consciousness, appearing not to warn or to cause, but simply to bear witness to moments when the structure of reality became thin enough for them to cross over from wherever they normally existed. The psychological effect was devastating. Delacroix suffered a complete psychotic break and had to be physically restrained after attempting to shoot himself with his service pistol while screaming that he couldn't bear to see anymore, that the weight of all those future disasters was crushing his mind, that the entities were showing him that catastrophe was woven into the very fabric of existence, and there was no escape from it. Morrison found herself unable to move, frozen in a state of catatonic terror as tears streamed down her face, and she whispered names of people she had never met, but now somehow knew were going to die on December 15th. 46 specific individuals, including a pregnant woman and 3 children under the age of 5, complete with details about their lives and final thoughts that she couldn't possibly have known through any normal means. Calabrese, drawing on reserves of psychological strength developed through years of combat experience, managed to maintain enough composure to document what was happening, recording observations into a handheld tape recorder, even as his voice cracked with barely suppressed panic, noting that the entities appeared to be communicating with each other through synchronized pulses of light from their eyes, creating patterns of red luminescence that swept across the foggy December night like some kind of infernal lighthouse, and that the temperature had dropped to impossible levels, with frost forming on interior surfaces of the heated underground facility, and their breath visible in clouds despite the bunkers. Environmental controls running at full capacity. The aerial assault continued for 47 minutes, during which several soldiers experienced symptoms of temporal disorientation, reporting that time seemed to slow down and speed up erratically, with seconds stretching into what felt like hours, while entire minutes would pass in what seemed like mere moments, as if the entity's presence was somehow disrupting the normal flow of causality itself. When the phenomenon finally ceased, the creatures didn't fly away, but instead simply vanished, blinking out of existence simultaneously, as if they had never been there at all, leaving behind a facility full of psychologically shattered personnel and Dr. Blackwood staring at instrument readouts that she kept describing as impossible and theoretically incoherent, data suggesting that during those 47 minutes, the facility and everyone in it had been simultaneously existing in multiple temporal states, experiencing both the present moment and future moments of December 15th superimposed on top of each other. Colonel Teague, who had maintained his professional military bearing throughout the encounter, despite obvious signs of extreme stress, made the decision that would define the rest of his career and condemn him to decades of classified debriefings. He ordered that anyone who wanted to evacuate Point Pleasant and the surrounding area before December 15th should be allowed to do so without prejudice, essentially confirming that military authorities believed the predicted disaster was real and inevitable, a decision that technically constituted desertion of post during a time when the Cold War made such facilities critical to national security, but which he later stated he would make again without hesitation because he couldn't stand by and do nothing while knowing what was coming. December 15th, 1967, 1700 hours, the Silver Bridge connecting Point Pleasant, West Virginia to Gallipolis, Ohio collapsed during evening rush hour exactly as the entities had shown in their visions. The suspension bridge's I-bar, number 330, on the north side failing due to a tiny crack that had been growing since the bridge's construction in 1928, invisible to inspectors and impossible to detect with the technology of the era. causing a catastrophic structural failure that sent the entire bridge and the 46 vehicles on it plunging into the 44-degree waters of the Ohio River below. 31 people died in those first terrible minutes as the frigid water and the impact of the collapse killed them instantly, while another 15 died during rescue attempts when hypothermia and drowning claimed them despite heroic efforts by first responders who were completely unprepared for a disaster of this magnitude. At Installation Delta 7, located approximately 8 miles from the bridge collapse site, every soldier who had experienced the precognitive visions knew the exact moment it happened, even though they couldn't see or hear the actual event. Calabrese would later describe it as feeling like a rubber band that had been stretched to its breaking point, suddenly snapping, releasing a wave of relief mixed with crushing guilt and grief that dropped several personnel to their knees in tears. Garrett, who had been sedated and confined to the medical bay after attempting suicide 3 times in the preceding week, let out a sound that the duty nurse described as the most heartbreaking thing she'd ever heard, a mixture of vindication and absolute despair, screaming, "I told them. I told everyone, but they wouldn't listen. They couldn't listen. This was always going to happen." Within hours of the collapse installation, Delta 7 was swarmed by military authorities from multiple agencies, including individuals from the Defense Intelligence Agency, Air Force Office of Special Investigations, and several civilians from organizations whose affiliations were never disclosed to the regular personnel. Colonel Teague was immediately relieved of command and escorted from the facility by military police. His career effectively ended by his decision to evacuate personnel against direct orders to maintain operational security, regardless of the predicted disaster, a decision that saved 6 lives but violated numerous protocols and confirmed to outside observers that the military had prior knowledge of the bridge collapse through some unexplained intelligence source. Dr. Blackwood and her team were ordered to pack all their equipment and documentation within 4 hours and were then flown out by helicopter. But not before she warned Calabrese that he and everyone else who had witnessed the entities needed to prepare for the consequences of forbidden knowledge, a cryptic statement that became horrifyingly clear in the months that followed. The entities made one final appearance on the night of December 15th with over 200 witnesses, including military personnel, emergency responders, and civilians, reporting seeing multiple large winged creatures with glowing red eyes perched on structures throughout Point Pleasant, simply watching the rescue efforts at the collapsed bridge without interfering. Their presence captured in several photographs that were quickly confiscated by federal authorities and have never been publicly released despite numerous Freedom of Information Act requests. The official military response to installation, Delta 7's reports of precognitive warnings about the bridge collapse, was swift and comprehensive. Within 72 hours, a story was constructed and distributed through military channels, claiming that the personnel at the facility had experienced a localized outbreak of mass psychogenic illness, possibly triggered by exposure to residual chemical contaminants from the old TNT plant's operations during World War II, combined with the psychological stress of Cold War surveillance duty and the isolation of their posting. That Mothman sightings, as civilian witnesses had begun calling the entities, were officially attributed to misidentifications of sandhill cranes, barn owls, and atmospheric phenomena, despite the absurdity of these explanations when compared to the detailed and consistent descriptions provided by multiple credible witnesses, including trained military observers. The facility itself was decommissioned with unusual speed, with all personnel reassigned to different posts within a week, and the underground bunker subsequently destroyed in a controlled demolition on March 3, 1968, officially justified as part of a base realignment initiative, but clearly designed to eliminate any physical evidence of the installation that had become associated with the paranormal encounters. The old TNT plant where the initial sightings occurred was designated a wildlife management area and placed off limits to public access, with the property surrounded by new fencing and patrolled by security contractors. whose employment records were classified under national security provisions. As for the entities themselves, they vanished from the Point Pleasant area after December 15th as suddenly and mysteriously as they had appeared, with no credible sightings reported in the region after the bridge collapse, as if the disaster they had heralded had somehow satisfied whatever purpose brought them to manifest in that location during those specific months. However, Dr. Blackwood's confiscated research files, portions of which were leaked to journalists in 1989 by an anonymous source within the Defense Intelligence Agency, revealed a disturbing pattern that entities or similar phenomena had appeared in at least 17 other locations around the world in the decades following Point Pleasant, always in the weeks or months before major disasters, including the 1986 Chernobyl nuclear accident, the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake, and the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing, suggesting that whatever these creatures were, they remained active globally, continuing to manifest at intersection points of catastrophic probability, marking disasters before they occurred, and subjecting witnesses to the terrible burden of awe, knowledge that couldn't be acted upon to prevent the inevitable. The witnesses from Installation Delta 7 found themselves scattered across different military postings, with their service records flagged in ways that prevented them from discussing their experiences with anyone outside of classified debriefing sessions, isolated from each other and from any support network that might have helped them process the trauma of their encounters, left alone with their memories of those burning red eyes and the crushing weight of having known a disaster was coming and being unable to stop it. The official military and governmental response to the Point Pleasant incidents established a template that would be replicated in subsequent encounters with the entities over the following decades: immediate classification of all evidence, psychiatric evaluation and isolation of witnesses, destruction of physical sites associated with the phenomena, and most importantly, the construction of alternative narratives that attributed everything to natural explanations, mass hysteria, or simple misidentification, despite the overwhelming consistency and credibility of witness testimony. The 47-page report, compiled by Dr. Blackwood's team, classified at a level above top secret and buried in a Defense Intelligence Agency vault at Fort Meade, concluded that the entities represented either a previously unknown form of consciousness that exists at quantum probability intersections and manifests physically at locations and times where catastrophic events converge, or alternatively, that they might be some form of temporal echo or projection from future disaster events, themselves somehow reaching backward through time to mark their own occurrence. A conclusion that read more like theoretical physics speculation and military intelligence assessment, but which apparently satisfied enough decision-makers to warrant the document's permanent classification. The human cost of Installation Delta 7's encounters proved devastating across the years that followed, with outcomes that seemed to validate the historical pattern of witnesses suffering disproportionate tragedy after contact with the entities. Staff Sergeant Vincent Calabresi was promoted to Sergeant First Class and transferred to a counterintelligence position in West Germany, where, according to partially redacted reports, he became increasingly obsessed with documenting unexplained phenomena and attempting to warn military authorities about disasters he claimed to foresee in his dreams, behavior that eventually led to psychiatric discharge in 1971, with diagnoses of post-traumatic stress disorder and delusional cognitive fix disorder, a psychiatric condition that appears in no standard diagnostic manual and may have been invented specifically to explain away the consequences of his encounters. Calabresi returned to civilian life in Pennsylvania, where he worked as a security guard and continued to maintain detailed journals of prophetic dreams that his family discovered after his death in 1989 from an apparent heart attack at age 47. Journals that allegedly contained eerily accurate descriptions of events, including the 1986 Challenger disaster and the 1988 Lockerbie bombing, written months or years before they occurred, though these journals were confiscated by federal authorities during the investigation into his death, and have never been made publicly available. Private First Class Raymond Dalacrone never recovered from his psychotic break, spending the remainder of his military service in psychiatric facilities before being medically discharged in 1969, and he died by suicide in 1973, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I can't see any more futures. I can't stop any more disasters. The red eyes are finally gone, but so is everything else," suggesting that the loss of his precognitive abilities, once they finally faded, left a psychological void even more devastating than the original trauma. Specialist Thomas Garrett was quietly retired from military service in 1968 with full disability benefits and relocated to Oregon under a new identity provided by military intelligence, living under government supervision and required to attend monthly debriefing sessions with Defense Intelligence Agency personnel until his death in a single-vehicle automobile accident in 1982 that investigators ruled was possibly intentional, as his vehicle left the road and plunged off a bridge into a river in circumstances that eerily echoed the Silver Bridge disaster he had foreseen 15 years earlier. Sergeant Angela Morrison was transferred to a desk position at the Pentagon, where her exceptional service record should have led to rapid promotion. But instead, she found herself stagnating in positions far below her capabilities, and after requesting multiple times to return to field duty, or at least to be given assignments that matched her training, she resigned from military service in 1975 and became a civilian psychologist specializing in trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, publishing several influential papers on the psychological effects of encountering unexplained phenomena without ever explicitly referencing her own experiences, maintaining her security clearances and silence about Point Pleasant until her death from cancer in 2003. The remaining 9 personnel who had witnessed the entities experienced a similar pattern of career stagnation, early retirement, psychiatric issues, and premature deaths from accidents and illnesses at rates that statistical analysis suggests were far above normal expectations for military personnel of their age and service records, as if contact with the entities had marked them for misfortune in ways that transcended simple psychological trauma. The physical evidence from Installation Delta 7 was methodically erased from existence, with the facility's destruction in 1968 followed by the confiscation of all equipment, documentation, and personal effects from personnel who had served there, creating a deliberate void in the historical record that has frustrated researchers and Freedom of Information Act requests for over 5 decades. The photographs taken on December 15th, showing the entities perched near the collapsed bridge, which were seen by multiple emergency responders and journalists before being confiscated, have never been released or even officially acknowledged to exist, though occasional references to them appear in declassified documents with heavy redactions that confirm something was photographed and suppressed. Dr. Blackwood herself vanished from public record after 1968 with no employment history, no publications, and no official existence beyond her appearances at Installation Delta 7, suggesting she was either operating under a cover identity or was subsequently placed in a deep classification program that erased her civilian presence entirely. The question of what the entities actually were remains officially unanswered, with competing theories ranging from extraterrestrial observers to interdimensional manifestations to temporal anomalies, but the consistency of their appearance patterns suggests they are neither random nor arbitrary, emerging specifically at locations and times where disaster convergences create conditions for their manifestation, serving some purpose that human understanding can only glimpse through the fragmentary visions they inflict upon witnesses. The broader implications of the Point Pleasant encounters extend far beyond a single military installation's brush with the unexplained, suggesting that there may be fundamental aspects of reality involving precognition, probability, and disaster convergences that governments around the world have chosen to classify and suppress rather than attempt to understand or utilize. If the entities truly do mark inevitable catastrophic events before they occur, then the military, And intelligence agencies that have documented their appearances possess a theoretical capability for disaster prediction that could save countless lives. But this capability comes at an apparently unacceptable cost to the mental health and lives of witnesses, creating an ethical dilemma that decision makers have apparently resolved by choosing suppression and denial over exploration and application. The personnel of Installation Delta 7 were sacrificed to this policy, left to bear alone the psychological burden of their encounters, while the knowledge they possessed was classified, analyzed in secret, and then buried in vaults where it serves no one except perhaps future researchers who may one day have the theoretical frameworks necessary to understand what Staff Sergeant Calabrese and his fellow soldiers witnessed in the cold November nights of 1966 in the hills above Point Pleasant, where something that defied explanation appeared from nowhere to mark a tragedy that no amount of warning could have prevented bearing witness to human suffering, with burning red eyes that saw not just the present, but the terrible weight of inevitable futures collapsing into a single catastrophic moment of bridge cables failing and lives ending, and the universe briefly allowing something from outside normal reality to cross over and observe what it means when structure and certainty dissolve into chaos and death. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality, and subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.